But I'll tell you what they don't want. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They're not interested in that. That doesn't help them. That's against their interest.
To tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship.
Now, to go on to the word fascism, I would describe the type of government into which we have evolved as essentially fascist, yes.
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
Trust the experts, trust the experts. Trust the science, trust the science. CDC, CDC, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Fauci. Mask on, mask off, 2 shots, 1 shot, mask on, 2 masks. Comply, comply.
Welcome to the Exit Your Matrix show, where we take the deep dive in search of truth. On the journey, we examine critical topics such as natural law, consciousness, morality, individual sovereignty, and the occult. And here's your host, Brad Villers. Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Exit Your Matrix show. Thanks for being with me. So today I want to continue with foundational material that we've been talking about. It's more conceptual in nature and it's more philosophical. And I just wanted to again ask that you be patient. It's very important that we set the groundwork for things that we'll lead into, but we've got to get an understanding of what's going on within our own minds, how our own minds are constructed, and all of these things that we really can't just run to something like natural law and immediately start to tackle. We've got to do these things as prerequisites. So let's go into a review of some things that we've already talked about very quickly. So truth. Truth is simply that which has happened and that which is happening now. We've also talked about knowledge. Knowledge is just information, and when we take knowledge and we properly apply it in the world, it is wisdom. And something that is a personal belief of mine, leave it up to you to make your own decisions about it, but I prefer to think that knowledge is not power. I prefer to think that wisdom is power because that is the knowledge that's then being applied into the world. We've talked about consciousness and including the 3 manifestations of consciousness. So we've got thoughts, emotions, and actions. And we've also talked about how critical it is that we have balance among those 3 things. We cannot have conflict in what we're thinking, how we're feeling, and then the way we act in the world and expect good outcomes. There will be negative consequences to that, and we've talked about that, and we'll continue to talk about that in terms of mindsets and worldviews. We've also talked about shared consciousness. So when we take our individual consciousness and we see how it interacts with the aggregate, we see that we are at what I call a node. Every individual is what I think of as a node of consciousness in a broader consciousness. And I think we can prove that out because when we act in a certain way, when our thoughts and emotions come to fruition in action, when we see those actions taking the same form in a large enough group of people, well, then we start to see consequences from that, and we start to see that aggregate behavior and that blending of thoughts, emotions, and actions. It has an impact on the rest of us, and it has an impact on the world. Triune brain. So the triune concept, that is 3 things in one. So we have that reptilian brain, the mammalian or emotional brain, and the thinking or the human brain, neocortex. We've also talked about neocortex and it being bisected. It has a left side and a right side, and we've talked about left brain imbalance, right brain imbalance. So what we have is some very significant things that can happen when we are either left brain dominant or imbalanced to the left brain, or right brain dominant or balanced to the right brain. And what we have there in terms of it coming to manifestation in the world is an imbalance to the right brain leads to slave and order follower behavior and worldview. And imbalance to the left brain leads to master order giver worldview. So So we've also covered solipsism. We'll continue to talk about solipsism because this is such an important item. So many people are of this mindset, and it can basically be defined as the notion of the philosophy that the only thing that one can know to be true is what is in one's own mind. So there is nothing outside of that, or if there is something outside of one's own mind, it is uncertain. And so what we have there is that we're trying to assert that an individual can determine truth by him or herself based on their own beliefs and their circumstances, rather than truth being affirmed in the universe and it simply being what is. So solipsism takes that, and it becomes so dangerous because we put that in the hands of individuals. And all of a sudden they can take certain facts and circumstances and outcomes that appear to be one way and pointing one way, and they say, no, I'm going to change that, and this has become my truth. Or I describe my truth as this. That could be completely in violation of what's going on in nature and in the world that we can perceive. We've covered what solipsism can do long-term as well, and this can often result in atheism, moral relativism, and ultimately social Darwinism, eugenics, and totalitarianism. So it's a very, very dark road you can go down when we start thinking in terms of solipsistic mindsets. So one thing I want to take a moment to do is, again, and I think I've said it before, I'll continue to talk about this because it's just such an incredible offer, and it's such an incredible resource of information and knowledge. Please, please go to Mark Passio's website, and I'm showing it here. It's whatonearthishappening.com, and he has an ARC tab. ARC stands for the Amazing Repository of Knowledge. And basically what this is you buy a 2 terabyte external hard disk in whatever form that you want to do that. It has to be 2 terabytes though. You then ship that off to Mark, and you do this with all these instructions that you'll get from his website. It's very clear how to do it. He will send you back that same disk full, and I mean it is full of thousands of audio files, thousands of ebooks, and thousands of videos. And I have just started scratching the surface of this, and it is extremely powerful. So if you want to tap into the kind of things I'm talking about in terms of knowledge, that is the best place to start, and I would highly encourage you to take him up on that. So one thing I wanted to talk about is this concept that we went into last time about how important it is to understand cause and effect. And my opinion that we spend a lot of our time, and I've spent a lot of my time over the past few years, really focusing on effect. You know, what's happening in the things that we're seeing and witnessing, and who or what is the cause of those things, and really not going too far back in that chain of events to understand what the true cause, what the root cause is of those things. And it's a big mistake that I was making for a long time, and I think I fell into what I'm doing now because I knew that that was just not, it wasn't satisfying. It wasn't what I was wanting to do. It wasn't where I needed to go. It wasn't foundational truth, and that started to become more and more clear as I was going along. So I wanted to share an example of this, causal factors, and how we can get sucked into thinking causal factors are really creating effects when they're really not. I was traveling with a work colleague of mine. We tend to travel quite a bit on the same accounts, and all of our lunches and dinners are usually spoken for because we have client or other activities going on. But we've kind of fallen into this habit of going to breakfast together. So he found a great breakfast place in a smallish city, I guess I would call it, large town, and predominantly manufacturing. And so kind of walked into this breakfast place, and I mean, it was just my style. It was so awesome. Old school. And one thing I loved about it is when we walked in, there was a group of gentlemen sitting that we walked right past, probably, I'd say 8 or so, looked like retirees. They were older gentlemen, and they were sitting there talking. It reminded me of my grandfather and his coffee club that he would go to, and the guys who would spend time with. But we sat down, settled in, And then I caught one piece of their conversation, and this was the only piece, but I heard one of them say, if we could only get a senator, and I can't remember what the rest of it that he said, but the thinking was, or at least what I took from what he was saying is that if we could get this one person in this one position, that would resolve the problem or problems. And to me, that just jumped out as an example of not really thinking in terms of causal factors, not thinking in terms of true cause and effect. That is certainly not the cause, and in my opinion, certainly is not going to fix anything. Things like politics, I think, are just an example of what we're told really is the cause to the effects, but it's not. So moving on, we have to acknowledge that there are behaviors that cause external realities. So what we're doing as part of this process is examining what those are, not only what the behaviors are, but what those external realities can cause and what those look like. So things like master and order giver behavior. Conversely, slave and order taker behavior. I want to look at, and I think it's important to look at, why? What is the motivation? What is the thinking that goes into a person relinquishing their selfhood and their freedom or freedoms? Maybe sometimes it's complete freedom, sometimes it just looks like it's a little bit of freedom that we've traded, but there is always a trade involved. And we do that in exchange for comfort and perceived protection. And I'm very interested in why that happens and why we do that. Along with that, we'll look at rampant consumerism, materialism, the me now kind of a culture. And we're going to look at other conditions that are in direct opposition of what we say we want. And I want to spend just a second on that because we often say we want freedom, we want liberty. Those are things that we believe in, and we go through all of these signs, and we say the pledge and put our hand on our heart and do all of these things. But in the end, when those very brief moments are over, what are we doing with the rest of our time and attention? Where does it go? And often it doesn't go to issues that concern our liberty and our sovereignty as individuals. So 2 other things. First of all, I'm having a lot of fun. I just wanted to share that. I know I can come off a little bit serious in these, and I'm working on that. I'm trying to kind of loosen up a little bit, but I'm having a really good time. And prepping for these shows is a lot of work, but it's really enlightening. And I'll go back to that ARC drive again. I'm getting so much out of that, and there's just an incredible amount of information and eye-opening, just amazing stuff there. I really can't come up with good enough words other than what I've said. But as part of that, I'm having fun. I'm really feeling like a part of me is kind of coming alive, and that is really a cool thing. And I think a lot of it has to do with just the focus that I'm putting into this, but also it's the information and it's the people I'm hearing from, and these themes and these ideas that are so impactful and so supportive of us as human beings and as free individuals. And then I also wanted to mention that I'm having, and I have experienced, especially over the last week, it's happened to me before, but this past week has been really cool. I am experiencing what I can only describe as, and I'm not an expert in this, but these are either synchronicities or they're manifestations. So, synchronicities are things that occur in the world, and we don't necessarily have a particular tie that we can make to them. We can't logically put them together. And I don't know if it's that, or what I'm hoping, and I'd like to think it is that these are manifestations. And so we look at all sorts of authors and personalities and thinkers over time. And these are not just in the areas that I've been talking about. We're talking about in the areas of things like business and entrepreneurship. Napoleon Hill. If you look at the book and the movie The Secret, and I apologize, I don't know the author's name. If you look at, anybody remember Kevin Trudeau, the guy who was on PBS all the time? You look and they're everywhere. But the consistent theme here is that if you harness the power of your mind and your thinking and your attention and you focus it, in an intensive enough way, things will start happening. Things will start happening that, if they're manifestations, you're obviously causing them to come into being, but you really can't understand why. But things start just falling out of the sky. So I'll give an example. My best friend Jay also lived in Houston for a while after we had graduated from college. I can't remember, it was 3-4 years maybe. And he had to move on, but when he did, he had taken a book of mine, and it was Give Me Liberty by Jerry Spence, to try to get some glare off of that. And he took my copy, and I had kind of forgotten about it, and then at some point he wanted to return mine. I think I noticed it was gone, or maybe asked him about it. Something happened, and it triggered him, and so he ended up buying me. This is the version. This is the book that he bought me. He's got mine, and so this is the one he sent or had sent to me, and I just wanted to share. He was kind enough to get me a signed version, so I'm pretty proud of that. But this book has been sitting on my bookshelf for a long time, and I've mentioned Jay and I talk about this show. He helps me with ideas and content and editing and all sorts of things. And we were catching up recently, and he asked me about this book. And it had just slipped my mind. It was sitting, 2 feet from my face. And I got it and started rereading it. And it really just became apparent to me that I was dealing with either a synchronicity or some kind of manifestation, because it's incredible what is here and how it speaks to the theme of what I'm very interested in and believe in. So I wanted to start with a quote from this. Jerry Spence was born in 1929 and is a semi-retired American trial lawyer. He's a member of the Trial Lawyer Hall of Fame. He has never lost a criminal case before a jury, either as a prosecutor or a defense attorney, and has not lost a civil case since 1969. He started as a small-town lawyer, but later became a successful defense attorney for the insurance industry. Years later, Spence said he, quote, saw the light and became committed to representing people instead of corporations, insurance companies, banks, or big business. But I thought then, as I do now, that the true test of liberty is the right to test it, the right to question it, the right to speak to my neighbors, to grab them by the shoulders and look into their eyes and ask, are we free? I have thought that if we are free, the answer cannot hurt us. And if we are not, must we not hear the answer? What if we have never known freedom and have been taught to embrace our bondage, to fight for it, even to worship it? What if we have been born in a cage like the polar bear at the San Diego Zoo, and having known nothing else, we accept the cage as freedom? What if our minds have been captured and played with, our minds molded as a child molds clay, our minds formed from birth to fit within the skull of the new American slave? What if our minds have been soaked in the brine of television, the voice of the corporate state that speaks to us for an average of more than 4 hours every day, from a cradle to grave, and converts us into that great amorphous glob called the American consumer? What if we are taught in school the state religion called capitalism, a religion that condemns as heresy all that interferes with the moneyed class extracting yet more money from those least able to protect themselves? What if the state's religion is the religion of the dollar, a faith based on a sort of economic Darwinism? What if a form of subtle slavery has been taught to us, made acceptable to us, made to appear even as freedom itself? What if we are not free, but instead are taught the faith of freedom, as Muslims and Christians and Buddhists are taught their faiths? So today's topic is polarity, and what this involves is two basic emotional underlying forces within us. They are essences, and as an essence, they can't be reduced any further, so they're in their essential form. They are primary. They are prime movers or causes, and this should have you kind of perk up a little bit when you hear cause, because again, cause and effect is so important. So this is a critical item. They are seemingly polar opposites, and I want to dive into that because when we think of them as polar opposites, as polarities, that's probably a misnomer. So let's take the example of hot and cold. They look like the opposite of one another, right? Polar opposites. Yet, if we dig a little bit further, we understand that hot is a description used for an abundance of heat energy in a particular object or space. Cold is a lack of heat energy, which we measure in temperature. So really, these are not two things that are opposites. In fact, they are just different descriptions of something that is along the same scale, which is temperature, hot, cold. Of course, we can measure that in degrees or something like that as well. Let's look at another example, light and dark. We naturally think those are the opposite of one another. But the truth of the matter is that dark is simply the native state. Dark is the state that anything is in unless it has light. So once we introduce light energy, then we are just measuring it by saying that it is light, or it has some degree of light. You can't throw darkness at something, but you can shine light on something, right? So let's think about this when we think about polarities in that classic sense of them being opposites. They're actually symbiotic. So let's talk about the first of these two forces. It's an essence of anything that makes us feel good, or that we perceive that makes us feel good, or it's something that we know to be good for us. It's a force that expands consciousness. It opens up and causes our consciousness to come alive. It is the first basic polarity, again, seemingly polarity, and it's called love. Now, I want to be very clear, this is not the romantic kind of love that we're normally taught to embrace, or that that's what love is all about. This is a very transcendent type of love, very, very different than that. The second of these seemingly polarities is a force that seeks to and does contract consciousness. It closes awareness. It causes a lack of interest in us in seeking and asking questions and desiring of truth. It's the second basic, again, seeming polarity, and it is fear. But it is very real. And on the subject of fear, I came across this quote from Mark Twain that I wanted to share with you. Now again, Mark Twain is someone who I think we all know enough about where I don't need to give a lot of background. Courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, not absence of fear. So both of these polarities have qualities that express within us and qualities that create something in our external reality. So we can call these internal and external manifestations. So let's tackle the internal expression or manifestation of love. So if we have this expansive force of consciousness within us, and we call it love, and it dwells within so that there is harmony between our thoughts, emotions, and our actions, the three expressions of consciousness, then if we don't have that internal conflict, what we find is that we have a person, so they think, so they feel, and so they act. We call that state self-love or enlightenment. It could be called balance, harmony, or even internal peace. Maybe internal peace is the best word, but you can pick any terminology that you like. One thing that's important to talk about and introduce within the concept of these three parts of our consciousness in thought, emotion, and action is a symbolic representation of consciousness. So if we look at the mind as being thought and of being an essence and like the creator or the father, then if we look at the internal quality of emotions, the spirit in which we do things as being the Holy Spirit, and then if we look at those two things creating a male child, because action is male in nature and has a male essence, the male child of the thoughts and our emotions are our actions, or the Son. Well, we've just described the Trinity. And it's interesting, I mentioned this, I can't remember if it was the last show or 2 shows ago, about how interesting it is that trinities or threes seem to appear a lot. But there we have another one. So let's also talk about opposition, because opposition is something that we see that prevents our thoughts, emotions, and actions, or our left and right brains from functioning as they should. So opposition is from an ancient Greek word meaning opposer, or opposition, or adversary. And that word is shaitan. And that is where we have our modern day word of Satan. And so it's a word that means to divide or oppose. It creates conflict or opposition. And this force gains entry into us when we are internally divided because our thoughts, emotions, and actions aren't consistent. And so there we are no longer one who thinks as they feel and so they act. So we'll often do things that are in opposition of how we say we feel. And when we do that, that's really a betrayal of our spirit, because our emotions and the thoughts that drive those emotions are telling us to go in a certain way, and we betray it. We turn our back on it, and we act in a different way and follow a different course. Therefore, shaitan, that original word, really isn't evil. It's not demonic. It really has no incarnation theme or mention about it. It's simply a way of being in the world. That's it. So the question that I have involves this concept of shaitan or Satan, and contrasting shaitan, which we've said is this way of being in the world, with the notion of Satan. And my question is basically boiled down to this. Is it possible that shaitan, this way of being in this world, has been incarnated, it's been hijacked, and turned into the form that we know of as the devil or Satan? And then if we dig a little bit deeper, and if we really ponder the two descriptions and explanations of the word, is it possible that there is something else going on? So one explanation has us believe that there is a force or being outside of ourselves that will torture and menace us if we don't do what we're told, religious teachings. And the other is an observably natural process requiring no external influence whatsoever, and we know it to be true because we experience it in our own lives. So, which would you say? Would you hold on to a belief system possibly that you were taught in this form of Satan? Or is it possible that there is something to that, there is a kernel of truth there, but you really have to look at it in this original form of shaitan, or this way of being in the world? I'd suggest giving it some thought. And I'll also be asking questions like that, and this is of particular interest to me because I think that if what I'm seeing is correct, and I think I am, this is a very powerful tool, and it's used often. A word or an idea or a concept is taken and it's hijacked. It's twisted into something else. Its meaning is changed. The record books are rewritten to reflect what the new meaning is supposed to be based upon our rulers and who is telling us how we're supposed to play the game. One question I've always been interested in is why? If we have all this information available to us, granted, it might take some digging, but it's there. It's not completely hidden. And some of these understandings are, I think, pretty well known, but probably ignored. Why do we do this? Why do we behave in this way? And the simple answer is because it's really hard. There are consequences of these actions, of taking a stand that doesn't comport with what everyone else thinks or what your friends thinks. What happens when you show up and say, wait a minute, I have a different way of thinking about this? What happens when people say, well, you changed your mind? Are you a flip-flopper? Can you handle that? Those are all pressures that come down and are very real, and I certainly understand them. So I came across this quote from Howard Zinn, and I was curious, does Howard Zinn's name ring a bell with you? And I'll let that sink in for a second while we cover a quote from him and his thoughts about courage. Born in 1922 and died in 2010, he was an American historian, playwright, philosopher, and World War II veteran. He was the chair of History and Social Sciences Department at Spelman College and a political science professor at Boston University. He wrote over 20 books, including his best-selling and influential A People's History of the United States in 1980. Sound familiar? Now, Zinn described himself as something of an anarchist, something of a socialist, maybe a democratic socialist. So in any case, I'm still trying to pull out the best that people have to offer, regardless of whether or not they have some thinking that is contrary to what I believe and I think to be true. In any case, Zen said, "The power of a bold idea uttered publicly in defiance of dominant opinion cannot be easily measured. Those special people who speak out in such a way as to shake up not only the self-assurance of their enemies, but the complacency of their friends, are precious catalysts for change." Now, have you been able to place Howard Zinn's name or the name of that book? So, why don't you take a look at this and see if this rings a bell?
The United States of America, A Complete History, Volume 1. Jesus. You want to read a real history book, read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. That book will fucking knock you on your ass. Better than Trump.
Yes, Good Will Hunting. So, if you got that right, good on you. Thought that'd be fun to do. In any case, let's move on to further discuss this issue of our thoughts, emotions, and actions not being in alignment and why that happens. So one of the things that we do to ourselves is we justify, and we're very, very good at it. And we look at apparent results of this imbalance between thought, emotion, and action. And I believe that we see them, and I think that we understand them. But I think that the power of us justifying and protecting all the things that are so valuable to us is so important. We have so many complex relationships in our lives. We have career, we have status, we have image. Our lives are not simple and straightforward. We seemingly have so much to lose, right? We have more than any known civilization in history, especially in terms of commercial goods. And the repercussions of losing those things are real. And we've been programmed to place a lot of value on those things, especially the consumer goods, the material goods, the status and image. And so are we really going to go out and start beating on a table or even just speaking our mind about a particular subject when we know that is going to probably raise eyebrows, have people look at us and say, well, wait a minute, you changed your opinion. You're a flip-flopper. We don't like that. We like consistency. We like people, even if they're going to die on the hill, they're going to dig in on that belief system, and they're never going to abandon it. That we think of that as virtuous. But again, if we go back to that first episode, saying I was wrong and I don't know are extremely powerful. And we see propaganda. We've heard Lippmann and Bernays, I referenced in the first episode, they have told us, they're on record as saying that these types of tools are being used to try to shape our minds, and they are used in a way that creates a value system for us. It makes those things that I talked about earlier, status, how we're viewed socially, what our image is, make those things so important, and in the process, we are able to move around and avoid and act in significant contradiction with that which we think and we feel. So I was looking around for some quotes, and naturally you can't get away from this subject without finding something from Sigmund Freud. So he has something I think pretty interesting to say about how we manage ourselves and how we let ourselves be managed. Most people do not really want freedom because freedom involves responsibility, and most people are frightened of responsibility. So another question, what does that quote mean to you? So let's just assume for a moment that what I'm talking about, this knowledge that I'm sharing with you, what if it changed your thinking? What would be the real world implications of you acting in the world, outside of the comfort of your home, and really going out there and showing that thinking to the world, sharing it with the world? Would you be able to do it? And I think it's a valid question. I'm certainly not asking from the perspective of if anyone says, no, I can't, or that's too much to lose or too much to say. I get it. I understand. What I'm trying to get across is that those things do exist, and those are barriers that we have to understand. And we can want truth and say we are all about truth and things like justice and all of these things that are related to truth, but if we can't act consistently and we can't think and feel consistently, then we're going to have a very hard time getting there. And as I've talked about before, the result is going to be suffering of some form. When the internal manifestation of love comes to fruition in a person, we call it sovereignty or dominion or even self-mastery. And in this state, we have a condition in which there is no external ownership or rulers involved. Now, I think it's interesting, and I would say important, to contrast this with all systems that we are involved in, and I would call them systems of control. But they are designed, specifically designed, with the goal of requiring that there is some external influence that's required. So let's look at religion, government, finance or money, education, the legal system. There are more, but if you look at any of these systems, they all have one huge thing in common, and they are that they require an outside intermediary. And I think that's very important, and I think we have to look at those systems from the vantage point of, if they're designed that way and they have that requirement, what does that mean? What are the implications of that? And I'm going to do some more work on systems of control in the future and probably have some separate sessions where I break down these systems of control one by one and go through them and present some, I think, some information that a lot of people don't have and maybe aren't aware of. And I'm going to do it in a way in which I'm really curious to have folks examine it and see if maybe they see it from a different point of view, or maybe from a different vantage point that doesn't have them feeling like they have to abandon that system, but to understand and respect it in terms of what it was designed to do and what its ultimate goal is, rather than simply the benefit that we receive from it. So talking about sovereignty further, sovereignty is a huge item, and it's so big because when I talked earlier in the show about finally coming around to some things that are going to be less conceptual, we have really come across the first of two very, very important discoveries, and that's sovereignty. And we've talked about it a little bit, but it's so critical in terms of this pursuit of truth. We've come to understand that our naturally fulfilled state has absolutely nothing to do with anyone or anything outside of ourselves. Now, I'm not denying that we've got an objective reality, which I've talked about at length, and it's out there and we have to deal with it. I get that. But sovereignty and truly understanding what sovereignty means is that we are our own world, if you will. And I am not saying that there is no spiritual world and there is no need for even religion. If that's what you're into, I have no problem with that. But what I will say is that if those things are viewed as a third party or an intermediary that's required for you to understand yourself and to reach your highest awareness, that I don't agree with. So this state of sovereignty is obviously extremely appealing, right? Who wouldn't want to be in this state where there is no requirement or requisite outside of themselves, and they have so much power, if you will, just within them? Sounds really interesting, and I'm sure a lot of people want it, and we say we want it, but it comes with prerequisites and it comes with responsibilities. And right now, I don't think we have the prerequisites, which I would say is this foundational understanding of ourselves and understanding of our very nature, nor are we behaving in a way that would indicate that we can handle this full sovereignty. And you may think you have sovereignty now, and I understand that, and that you're completely free, but hopefully as we go through this, you'll understand that that's certainly a misconception. We have given up, whether you call them immaterial freedoms or material freedoms, it doesn't matter. You can't deny that an exchange has happened. We have traded away freedoms and a certain amount of our sovereignty in exchange for things that we think are valuable. Whether that's right or wrong is a different conversation, but we have to understand that that did happen. And so I don't think that we can handle a full state of sovereignty right now, and that what we experience is exactly what we are earning. It's exactly what we are getting as a mirror image of what we are putting into the world, which is a lot of poor thinking and emotion and action, and certainly thought, emotion, and action that is disjointed and is in conflict. Because we say we want to be free, and yet as we're saying it, we accept and just put our heads down and put one foot in front of the other as those things and those freedoms are taken away from us. And we can see it. It's not hard to find. So where we have an internal opposition between our thoughts, emotions, and actions, the result is confusion. And confusion is a state of internal disharmony. It's a state of consciousness being closed down and cut off from our higher self, our higher levels of awareness. And someone in this condition is not capable of discerning truth from falsehood. They do not have self-love that we talked about earlier. Thus, they can't understand or even value sovereignty or truth. These are the led. They're order takers and they are followers. And they can be made to do things. Go back to propaganda that we talked about earlier. They do not see the connection between truth and improving the quality of their life. It is the internally manifesting quality of fear, is confusion. So here's another example of one of those either synchronicities or manifestations, I don't know which again, that has happened. I completely stumbled across this article, but I thought it was very interesting because it's talking about exactly the topic that we're on right here, which is fear. And this was a meta-analysis. So what I'm going to read you is not from the study itself. It's from an American Psychological Association synopsis of the study. And it was published in the Psychological Bulletin. And so really what they were looking at is fear-based appeals, or fear-based messaging, I would call it. And so let me read you a couple of points from this. Fear-based appeals appear to be effective at influencing attitudes and behaviors, especially among women, according to a comprehensive review of over 50 years of research on the topic, published by the American Psychological Association. These appeals are effective at changing attitudes, intentions, and behaviors. There are very few circumstances under which they are not effective, and there are no identifiable circumstances under which they backfire and lead to undesirable outcomes, end quote, said Dolores Albarracin, Ph.D., professor of psychology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and an author of the study published in the journal Psychological Bulletin. Fear appeals are persuasive messages that emphasize the potential danger and harm that will befall individuals if they do not adopt the message's recommendations. While these types of messages are commonly used in political, public health, and commercial advertising campaigns, their use is controversial as academics continue to debate their effectiveness. It goes on to say that they also confirmed prior findings that fear appeals are effective when they describe how to avoid the threat. So let's move now to the external manifestation of the force of love, and it is freedom. So we have just now come across the second major discovery on our journey to truth. The first was sovereignty, which is the internal manifestation of love. Now we have the external manifestation of love, which is freedom. Very important to know that we only have freedom when we have enough, and we don't know exactly what that number is, but in the aggregate, it's by and large the majority of individuals. Their individual consciousness is aligned. Thoughts, emotions, and actions are in harmony. As they think, so they feel, so they act. And that's a significantly larger number than we have right now, because I think that's exactly why we are in the state that we're in, is because we have far too few people who are in that condition. These people have that balance among their thoughts, emotions, and actions. They have made a free will decision to conduct themselves in that way. And again, to go back to what I said earlier, I understand that doing so has implications. And I think that is probably one of the most fertile areas to think of is if this really does resonate with you, if it really does have an impact on you, what does it mean if you actually adopted this thinking? What does it mean to you in the world in which you live? Not just within your own thoughts and emotions, but when we move into action, what does that look like? What are the potential consequences? And I think that's a fair word to use. Sounds kind of scary, but I think it's very real. And I think it's why so many of us are kept from getting to where we want to go in that way. We are so fearful of the consequences, of the things that we might lose and the relationships that might be injured. So in terms of authority, which is the last topic that we want to take up, authority and control, I found a quote by Timothy Leary, and if you don't know Timothy Leary, he's talk about a fascinating guy. I'll give you a little bit of background about him. He was born in 1920 and died in 1996. He was an American psychologist and author known for his strong advocacy of psychedelic drugs. Evaluations of Leary are polarized, ranging from bold oracle to publicity hound. He was, quote, a hero of American consciousness, end quote, according to Allen Ginsberg, and Tom Robbins called him a, quote, brave neuronaut. He worked at Harvard University at the Harvard Psilocybin Project, but ultimately he was fired along with his colleague Richard Alpert, who is now known as Ram Dass, in May of 1963 after it was discovered that he had not only taken LSD, but had apparently encouraged students to also take it. Now that is certainly in question. So it's so good that we were able to capture such a dangerous person like this and get him off the streets. Wait, I'm sorry, what's this? Oh, that's interesting. It looks like the Johns Hopkins Medical Center has established something very similar and is now doing that same kind of research, but nothing to see here. Throughout human history, as our species has faced the frightening, terrorizing fact that we do not know who we are or where we are going in this ocean of chaos, it has been the authorities, the political, the religious, the educational authorities who attempted to comfort us by giving us order, rules, regulations, forming in our minds their view of reality. To think for yourself, you must question authority and learn how to put yourself in a state of vulnerable open-mindedness, chaotic, confused vulnerability to inform yourself. I really like that quote. And on the heels of that, control is going to be the last topic for today. And control is a state that starts as authority, what Leary was talking about, and it results in slavery. And that slavery is simply defined as the external manifestation of the force of fear. So fear divides us, puts us into a state of internal conflict and confusion. Then we have large numbers of people who feel that way. Their thoughts, emotions, and actions are not in sync. They have little interest in and little concern about truth and morality. And so what we have resulting from that is a large group of people in a mindset of control. And control is people wanting to control others. It's people wanting to have a say over what others do, think, and how they feel, regardless of whether or not they're causing harm or violating others' rights. And that's going to be a very key point, and that there's a kernel there of natural law. And again, we're going to keep moving forward, and as we do and we get some more of this conceptual information behind us, we'll be able to tackle those subjects. But this key of doing something while not violating someone else's rights or harming them, that's a very key component and largely a basis for natural law. So the final synchronicity or manifestation, perhaps, that I was referring to at the beginning of the show is from a book that I've referenced before that I've been reading and finally finished with my friend David. And it's organized, I think I told you, in talks, not chapters, and there are 8 total. And so as we were going into this final talk, which is talk number 8, it was just incredible, because here I am talking about all this information right in the middle of this conceptual, philosophical discussion of some of these topics, and then we get this. So this is from Jitta Krishnamurti. He was born in 1895 and died in 1986. His interests included psychological revolution, the nature of mind, meditation, holistic inquiry, human relationships, and bringing about radical change in society. He stressed the need for a revolution of the psyche of every human being and emphasized that such revolution cannot be brought about by any external entity, be it religious, political, or social. He had no allegiance to any nationality, caste, religion, or philosophy, and spent the rest of his life traveling the world, speaking to large and small groups as well as individuals. And this comes actually from one of those talks that he did, this particular one in Ojai, California, where he lived. To put it differently, we start our lives with assumptions, with postulates, that there is or there is not God, that there is heaven, hell, that there must be a certain form of relationship, morality, that a particular ideology must prevail, and so on. With these assumptions, which are the product of the collective, we build a structure which we call education, which we call religion, and we create a society in which rugged individualism is either rampant or controlled. This society is based on the assumption that it is inevitable and necessary to have competition, that there must be ambition, envy. And is it possible not to build on any assumption, but to build as we inquire, as we discover? If the discovery is that of somebody else, then we immediately enter the field of the collective, which is the field of authority. But if each one of us starts with freedom from assumptions, from all postulates, then you and I will build a totally different society, and it seems to me that this is one of the most fundamental issues at the present time. I think that's great stuff. So remember, today's topic was really about this issue of polarities in the mind, what those create, and constantly thinking about the implications of and how we can try to align more our thoughts, emotions, and actions, and what it means if we were to start thinking differently, and to start feeling differently, and to start acting differently. What are the consequences? What are the implications for us in our daily lives? I hope this has been helpful. It's great having you with me. I hope to see you next time. Thanks a lot.